Hi there everyone, welcome to the first video for week 6. I had to do a little bit of mental math in my head. And for this week we're going to be covering Spinoza's Ethics. Now hopefully I remembered to mention in the announcement that this is probably one of the most technical and difficult works that we're going to be tackling here together. It's kind of notorious for its style, the way that it's written, and so it might be helpful to, in this case, watch the video before you try to tackle the text. Of course, do whatever you ultimately feel most comfortable with. If you'd rather read it first, you're more than welcome to. However, I think that in this case, you just need a lot of help, and you deserve a lot of help. And so that's why we're going to do 2 videos this week. I anticipate that this video might run a little bit long, and so I apologize in advance for that. Feel free to watch it over multiple sessions or do whatever you need to do for your own study habits. But Spinoza is a very difficult thinker, and if before we were looking at unfinished fragments, we were looking at letters that he sent, today we're really focusing on his magnum opus, the Ethics. And this is a book that is, up there with the Meditations, let's say that, right? It's considered sort of a hallmark or a classic. It's extremely well loved. People love it in part because of how extremely ambitious it is, The Meditations, in a lot of ways, was pretty limited, it was relatively short text, and even though there are enormous strides in the Meditations, like it tells us, how knowledge is possible and to what extent, Descartes had to write other books to explain his ethical and political sort of orientation, especially the passions of the soul. I mean, we saw even in Descartes' letters to Elizabeth that he was willing to admit that the Meditations is in many respects incomplete. Whereas by contrast, Spinoza designed the Ethics to be a complete worldview. He is going to tackle everything from, all of this stuff about God that we're reading in the first part, to an account of the emotions and the passions and how you can be closer to God and what it means to live a good life, right? And so that's why it's the Ethics, right? He really does think that you get from this a picture of what the good life looks like. And so Spinoza, gives a metaphysics, an epistemology, a philosophy of mind, a theory of the emotions, a theory of the afterlife, all of that kind of stuff within one book, right? One single solitary book. And as we saw with Bayle, Spinoza, and we're going to talk a lot more about Bayle in our next video, Bayle and Lessing, which is the other very, very short piece that you have to read for this week. Yeah, I forgot where I was going, but that's what you're going to read, or what you have to read for this week and what is going to be discussed in more detail next week, right? And so the point I was making in general was just that the Ethics is a very difficult text. It is one that is going to be stylistically very foreign to a lot of you, I am sure. And so it's just going to take us a little bit to work everything out together. And that's mainly what this video is meant to do. I'm not really going to do a ton of close readings of individual texts or propositions in this video, mostly because there's so much that you could do, and that I'm not really sure that a very technical discussion of the specific structure of an argument or something like that is going to be as productive as trying to get a handle on like what's going on in general. You know, why does someone think that they can write a book like this, and why do they do it? You know, so like the meditations began with Descartes, you know, sort of like describing himself sitting by the fire, you know, beginning to meditate and all of that kind of stuff. Spinoza's style is very different, right? If you open up the meditations, it reads like a math textbook. That is very intentional. Spinoza, and we're going to the board now. At the top, I've written Spinoza's Ethics, and here at the top, I've written that Spinoza uses a geometrical method based on Euclid. So, for those of you who don't know, Euclid was a Greek mathematician. He wrote a book called The Elements, right? That's right? I think so. And that book was famous for essentially laying down all of the essential tools for geometry and laying them out in a sort of systematic fashion so that people could learn from it. So it was like essentially the first math textbook, and it was an extremely good one. And it's one that, like, if you were to go up an hour north to St. John's, like if you're a math major, there you read Euclid. And you actually like go through and learn mathematics in like the old style way, right? And so what was unique about Euclid's approach to mathematics is that he had a very formal approach to mathematics, right? He thought that like in order to really teach and understand mathematics, you have to present it in a certain style, in a certain way, right? That sort of reflects a kind of mathematical thinking. And so both Euclid and Spinoza give a way of presenting information that's sort of divided up into definitions, axioms, propositions, and scholiums, right? And so the idea is, you know, in Euclid, if you knew that a triangle is, you know, I don't know, a bound two-dimensional figure, you know, that's that has three angles or three sides or, you know, something like that. If you know what a triangle is, then Euclid reasoned you could figure out certain mathematical facts about triangles, right? And so you can know from a definition and from certain axioms certain features about geometrical figures and shapes, right? And so the way that Euclid and Spinoza sort of utilize a geometrical method is they say, okay, well, we had to begin with some definitions so that we know what we're talking about. And then we have some very kind of like self-evident rules, right? Rules that make sense, that you can understand, that insofar as you know what they're saying, you know that they make sense, right? That's the general idea. And then from them you have propositions, right? You can then sort of create proofs. It's like, okay, if, you know, my definition of a triangle is true, and if we're working on a two-dimensional plane or whatever, you know, that sort of thing, then I can know, okay, there's 100, the interior angles of the triangle are going to amount to 180 degrees. Something like that, right? You can know these geometrical facts about triangles from their definition and from mathematical facts that should be obvious, right? 3 is bigger than 2. Things like that. And then scholiums are just sort of like an addendum to a proposition. They're like a further explanation or an engagement with their contemporaries, things that are not strictly required by the systematic form. Sometimes, like Spinoza will give other proofs in scholiums, right? And so the ethics is really divided up into these different parts, right? In the same way that mathematics is. And mathematics is Spinoza's model for knowing the essences of things, right? So, like, I don't need to go out and experiment and like find triangles in the world or something like that to determine if their interior angles add up to 180 degrees. And it's not like that's like an average that I get from like looking at a whole bunch of cases. It's not like it just sort of averages out to 180 degrees. No, I know with absolute necessity, if it is a triangle and it, meets these conditions, the interior angles of the triangle will equal 180 degrees. It doesn't matter any facts about the universe, right? There can be no triangles in the entire universe from the start of the universe to the end. And it would still be true that the triangle, the essence of the triangle contains these mathematical facts, right? And so the reason why Spinoza is so enamored with mathematics and, what kind of makes him a rationalist ultimately, right, is this belief that what mathematics does is by focusing on these formal qualities, right, they capture the essence of things, right? They capture a way of correct thinking, which is actually reflected in one of the axioms of the ethics in the first part that we read together, that if you want to know stuff, right, you have to go from cause to effect, not from effect to cause. What do I mean by that, right? Well, Spinoza's point is that when I proceed from definitions and axioms to propositions, then I know stuff in an essential way. I don't know it in an accidental way. It's not like, I'm looking at the results of an empirical experiment and I'm guessing about what the cause is, right? Spinoza, at one point in the Ethics, describes empirical knowledge by saying that essentially, like, what experience gives us and what empirical knowledge gives us are conclusions without premises. Right? And this is what it means to be a finite thing, is we don't know sort of the ultimate nature of the world, or at least we don't typically, like we don't prior to reading the ethics, right? And so we don't know like how stuff in the world is produced. We don't know like how clouds form, for example. We only know that they give us rain. And then, through a scientific process, through some kind of reasoning, right, we try to make an inference from the effect to the cause. But for Spinoza, that kind of reasoning is always uncertain, right? You're not sort of beginning in the correct order. If you don't know the premises, the conclusion could come from any different number of premises, right? You can never know with absolute certainty that way. But I can know with absolute certainty that every triangle, the interior angles add up to 180 degrees. Right? And so Spinoza thinks, well, if you can think like a mathematician, if you can try to move from the cause to the effect rather than from the effect to the cause, if you can think about essential knowledge, right, rather than accidental empirical knowledge, then you can use the structure, the dynamics, the tools, the formal apparatus of mathematics and put it to work for metaphysics, for an account of the human emotions, right? Spinoza's account of the human emotions is very fascinating. He thinks that you can treat the emotions like you treat anything in mathematics. For Spinoza, there's an essence of joy, and there's an essence of hatred. And you can know things about the relationship between joy and hatred, or joy and sadness, in the same way that you can know mathematical facts. And that's why Spinoza thinks that this results in an ethics, is that you can know with complete certainty that cultivating certain kinds of emotions and dispositions are essentially related to your freedom and your happiness. Joy. This is the most profound emotion for Spinoza. Joy is when you agree with the world, right? When something brings you joy, right? You feel that your own sort of belonging in the world is higher, right? That you fit in to the world in a certain way, at least for a moment. At least that is what a certain kind of sensation produces. And so for Spinoza, it produces a heightening of your power. Whereas all of the emotions based in what Spinoza calls sad passions, right? Emotions like envy. This provides a certain kind of satisfaction, right? If you're envious of somebody and then, bad things happen to them, right? It's like that kind of agrees with you in a certain way, right? You get a certain kind of happiness, a Schadenfreude, which is like an enjoyment at someone else's suffering, right? But these kind of sad passions, right, they're always based in negativity, right? They're always based in sadness. And so for Spinoza, the point of the ethics really is to cleanse us of these sad passions, that a rational understanding of our own place in the universe can demonstrate essentially the reason for why an intellectual love of God brings joy. An intellectual love of God brings joy because when you engage in a rational knowledge of God and the order of nature, then you understand why you must exist within it. You understand your agreement with the universe, right? And this is what produces a lasting, genuine, spiritual happiness. Is not just sort of like flimsy belief, that there is a God and God's looking out for me because things are, I'm up, things are going good for me, right? But the intellectual love of God is immune to these, to this kind of arbitrariness or caprice or fate, right? If my love of God and my belief that God is, kind of looking out for me or whatever, is just based in how things are going for me right now, then when things go badly, my love of God does not in that way allow for me to have a joyful existence in the world. It's a manifestation of one of the sad passions that Spinoza wants to eliminate, which is fear, right? I believe that God's looking out for me in that case out of a kind of wishful thinking. And as we mentioned in last week's video, this kind of wishful thinking is really what this entire apparatus, the whole point of all of this, is made for. Right, so I have written over here in this kind of box, what is the point? Why would you choose to write a text like this? Is Spinoza just a mathematics fanboy, right? Why? What is the point? Well, Spinoza genuinely believes that what this method allows for is the elimination of a certain kind of prejudice. And this is particularly emphasized in the appendix to part 1, which is part of your readings. So please take a very good close look at that appendix because it's very important for understanding Spinoza. And one of the central prejudices that we have is anthropocentrism, which is something that I mentioned last week. So we have a tendency, as finite creatures, things do not always agree with our nature, right? You can get squashed like a bug by somebody bigger and stronger than you, right? That's essentially what it means to be finite, is it means that you can be limited by other things. The world can wear you down. That's essentially Spinoza's point. And because of this, you have natural kind of responses like fear. And this fear becomes blended with other emotions and emerges as a kind of wishful thinking, right? You think the universe is set up for your success because you need it to be set up for your success, because you desperately would like it to be set up for your success. And even though Spinoza genuinely understands the place that this fear comes from, right? He nonetheless believes that it prevents you from, a genuine kind of transformation into an intellectual love of God. And it only lets you remain at the level of superstitious belief. And that superstitious belief will not be able to consistently lead you to happiness and joy. And so, another aspect then of Spinoza's picture is that Spinoza rejects so many features of God that were present for other thinkers like Descartes. So, for Descartes, the problem of evil is a genuine problem, right? Why is there evil in the world if God is all good? That is a problem for Descartes, because for Descartes, God is all good. But for Spinoza, God, it only names the substance of the world. It doesn't name a person. It's not a judge. It's not somebody that's essentially like us, right? And this is the essential superstition that Spinoza believes is present in all monotheistic religions, and in fact a bunch of religions that are not monotheistic, is that the divine, the essential nature of the universe, reflects our own precarity, right? In the same way that we're uncertain about stuff and we have to make decisions, then we think about God that way, right? Things are good or bad for us. They agree with us or disagree with us. And so we imagine that things can agree or disagree with God. But if you are purely rational about it, then Spinoza believes you'll realize that good and bad only have meanings in reference to finite creatures. Things can be good or bad for me because things can take away from my power, they can add to my power. But God, being the underlying substance of everything and nature itself, there's nothing that can be bad for God. God is the totality. God is the predator as well as the prey. God is the typhoon as well as the people that are washed away by the typhoon. And that is just a very different image of God and the divine, right? God is, from that standpoint, indifferent in everything that happens in the universe, according to Spinoza, is strictly necessary. Strictly necessary. So, horrible events, great evil, profound historical and cultural problems, war, all of it is necessary, right? None of it is based in human sadness or finitude or something like that. It's not based on decisions that we make, our own mistakes, the way that we tend to moralize, these sort of things. It belongs to the essential structure of the universe. And if you realize that, then you realize that they're not quite so upsetting. What is upsetting, ultimately, for at least in Spinoza's opinion, is that it upsets our own selfishness, right? It upsets our own narcissism, that the world does not sort of reflect our own interests, beliefs, and desires. So it's very, very fascinating stuff, right? You can see why a ton of scientists would be very attracted to this kind of view, in part just because it says everything about the world is rationally understandable. There's nothing in the universe that God does not understand. So there's nothing ineffable, there's nothing profoundly unknowable. There's no cut, as there is in Descartes, between an immanent human perspective and a transcendent God, right? We are nothing but manifestations of God. And as manifestations of God, we have a share of God's power, right? We know some stuff. And in our knowing, like our knowing of essential facts about triangles, we participate in the kind of knowing that God has. We know the universe as it really is. And so that's really a lot of the point in the general picture. And so here, I'm going to scoot this, I guess, over this way a little bit. So here, rather than like go proposition by proposition and the first, however many propositions of the book and sort of trace the argument step by step, I want to give a general picture, right, of like what does the universe look like according to the ethics? Like what is he trying to say before we get into all the proofs, all that kind of stuff, right? And essentially for Spinoza, there's like 3 building blocks of the universe. And we're familiar with this because all of this stuff appeared already in Descartes. For Spinoza, there's one and only one substance. And he proves this hypothesis roughly within the first 15 or so propositions of the ethics. And the basic thrust of the argument goes like this. He says, like, well, what is substance? Substance is the independent thing, the thing that all of the properties adhere to, the thing that exhibits a genuine kind of independence, the thing that all of the other stuff, the modifications, are modifications of, the thing that it's dependent on, right? And the essence of Spinoza's thinking consists in trying to say, like, well, if you imagine 2 genuinely independent, self-subsistent things, then they're both not genuinely independent, right? They have to interact in some way or share some kind of relation, right? Insofar as there's 2 of them, but that relation undermines the independence, right? And this is essentially what Descartes was arguing in the Principles of Philosophy, if you'll recall. He said that God is the absolute substance and that all finite substances are dependent on him. We cannot imagine there being more than one absolute substance, because if there were more than one absolute substance, it would no longer be absolute, right? That's why Descartes starts talking about finite substances. But as we discussed last week, Spinoza is a radical rationalist, so he's not going to accept the equivocation between absolute substance and finite substance. He just rejects the whole category of finite substances. He says it is incoherent to imagine that there's more than one substance to the universe. The universe is essentially one way. There's one God. There's one universe. There's one nature. There's one thing of which we are all a manifestation or an expression. Sometimes he'll say parts. But it's important too that we know that substance is indivisible. Substance does not have parts, right? For the same reason that there aren't multiple substances. If substances had parts, then the parts would be more fundamental than the substance. The substance would just be an aggregate of parts. They could come together, they could not come together, right? So substance has to be indivisible. And so that's why the terms expression or manifestation are oftentimes more appropriate for understanding like how we participate in substance. And so even though there's one substance, and this substance is characterized by the absolute positive infinity, it's causa sui. This is the first definition that we get in the ethics. I'll write this down over here, causa sui. And this is the absolute infinitude of God, is that while everything else in the universe is caused by something else, God is the cause of itself. God exhibits absolute independence, right? God causes him, her, them, whatever, self, itself. And so, God, as the absolute infinity, the cause of itself, the substance of everything that is in the universe, is revealed through certain attributes. We know of two of them, thought and extension. But because substance is absolutely infinite, there have to be an infinite amount of attributes that we don't understand. It's fascinating, right? All this infinite dimension of God's nature that we cannot know, but that God must know. Interestingly, at one point one of Spinoza's friends sends him a letter and is like, hey, well, why do we have access only to two if there's an infinite number? And what Spinoza says is, well, we have a body and we have a mind. Okay, right? Fair enough. You can take on this sort of Cartesian idea. These are fundamentally distinct. There is a real distinction between extension, the attributes of extension and thought, but it's a real distinction, but not a numerical distinction, right? I'll write that down. Real, not numerical distinction. Which means that the thoughts and minds really are different. They do have different orders, as Descartes kind of pointed out. That's the basis of Descartes' dualism. Is this insight that the nature of extension and the nature of thought are different? But they're just two ways of expressing, two ways of referring to one substance, right? And so this is why Spinoza is called a monist, is because he says there's one fundamental substance to the universe that gets expressed in a whole bunch of different ways, right? At the level of attributes, it gets expressed in extension, in thought, and in all those other attributes that we know must exist from the essence of God, but we have no idea about, right? So there's substance and there's attributes. And attributes are the essential ways that God expresses themselves. And then we have particular things that we can call modes, right? Um, this, these are all of the particular things in the universe. These are the soda cans. These are all of the bodies, all of the minds, all of the stuff that is extended or is a thought. And Spinoza says, well, because God is absolutely infinite, there must be an infinite number of modes. Right? And keep in mind, mode, modification. These are just different ways that God is modified. There are different ways that God changes over time, right? Different ways that God is expressed. And so you might notice that here these lines parallel one another, right? They don't interact with one another. And so we can say that Spinoza's thought is often referred to as dual aspect monism. And here, the most important proposition is in part 2, proposition 7. So that is the last proposition that you have to read for our readings. So it's very, very important that you read that one closely. And what happens here is that essentially Spinoza agrees with, figures like Elizabeth and Amo. Spinoza agrees that it is incoherent to imagine an interaction between extension and thought, right? Instead, the way that we should think about them is as parallel. And he uses this language explicitly. And so this is often called Spinoza's parallelism, right? And the basic idea is bodies cause stuff in other bodies, minds cause stuff in other minds. They reflect one another, right? What I think reflects the universe, right? It reflects, like if I think, these are my headphones, right? My idea of the headphones corresponds to the actual material thing, the headphones, the body in question. But my mind doesn't cause the thing, right? My mind, I don't have telepathic powers, I can't move bodies, etc. with my mind, right? But my ideas cause other ideas, and bodies cause other bodies. And this parallelism extends infinitely, right? And that's why we can imagine, there being, not just two parallel lines, but an infinite number of parallel lines emerging from, a single substance. I mean, I don't know, drawing the substance as the sun doesn't actually result in the lines being exactly parallel, but hopefully you understand the basic idea, right? Basic idea is there's two aspects of the world that we know about, bodies and minds. And they're parallel because they don't interact with one another, but they do reflect one another, which is why my mind seems linked up to the world, right? And so I wrote here dual aspect monism, part 2, proposition 7, versus Cartesian interactionist dualism, right? Because in the Cartesian picture, minds and bodies interact. They don't just parallel one another. It's not that bodies only cause bodies and minds only cause minds. In the case of embodiment, they cause each other. Descartes would be dissatisfied with Spinoza because he would say to Spinoza, well, you provide something of an explanation for why, when I think my hand should go up, my hand goes up, right? But you kind of rob me of my own freedom, right? From Spinoza's point of view, it's not that my mind caused my body to do something, which is what I normally think is happening, right? There's no causal interconnection there at all. In fact, it all goes back to the one substance, right? It seems like all of the causal force in the universe, everything, right, is sort of packed in to that one substance that Spinoza calls God. And that's why our next video, we're going to be discussing more of the controversy surrounding Spinoza's thinking, specifically surrounding what is often called Spinoza's monism or his pantheism. I hope that this video was helpful, and I've been really thrilled with what you all have written on Spinoza so far. So I'm really excited to be able to get into this more. Okay. Hope you're having a great week. Hope that the next video is helpful too. Bye.